The web of retribution. Beneath the glittering skyline of Manhattan, where ambition and desire intertwined like tendrils of ivy on stone, lived Jonathan Graves, a man of quiet success and unshakable loyalty. He built his wealth not on shortcuts, but on grit, honesty, and sleepless nights. To Jonathan, his greatest treasure wasn't the penthouse apartment or the luxury cars, but his wife, Elise, a woman whose elegance could halt time itself. For 10 years, their life seemed idyllic, their union unshakable. Elise was his muse, his confidant, and his world. Or so he thought. One evening, Jonathan returned home earlier than expected. His conference in Chicago cut short. Entering their apartment, he noticed details that set his instincts on edge. An unfamiliar cologne lingering in the air, a glass of red wine half drunk beside hers, and the faint murmur of voices behind the bedroom door. Heart pounding, he stood frozen. Yet instead of bursting in, a sharp clarity overcame him, a stillness like the eye of a storm. Jonathan turned and left, determined not to act in haste, but to outmaneuver betrayal with patience and precision. The mask of deception. The days that followed were a test of Jonathan's will. He smiled when Elise greeted him with her usual warmth, suppressing the surge of anger that bubbled within. He knew confrontation wouldn't suffice. It would only give her the satisfaction of knowing she'd hurt him. No, his revenge would be artful, a masterpiece of justice she'd never anticipate. Jonathan's first move was to hire a private investigator. Discreetly, the man shadowed Elise's every step, compiling a dossier that revealed more than Jonathan could bear. Her lover was Daniel Mercer, a colleague from her law firm, a man of mediocrity cloaked in charisma. Jonathan studied the details, like a general preparing for war. But instead of lashing out, he began weaving a web so intricate, so untraceable, it would leave Elise and Daniel entangled in their own undoing. The long game. The first step was financial. Jonathan, a majority shareholder in Elise's law firm, anonymously initiated a quiet audit that uncovered discrepancies, funds Daniel had funneled to support his lavish lifestyle. With evidence in hand, Jonathan leaked it to the board. Daniel was swiftly terminated, his reputation tarnished, his career in ruins. But Jonathan wasn't done. Next, he turned his focus to Elise. He transferred their shared assets into a trust controlled solely by him, ensuring she'd have no access once. The time was right. Then he began subtly planting seeds of doubt in her mind, mentioning Daniel's financial troubles, implying he knew more than he let on. Elise grew restless, her guilt manifesting in erratic behavior. Yet Jonathan remained the picture of a devoted husband, his calm demeanor driving her deeper into paranoia. The reckoning. 6 months later, the stage was set for the grand reveal. Jonathan planned a dinner party to celebrate their anniversary, inviting close friends and colleagues, including Daniel, who had been clawing his way back into Elise's life. Under the guise of a toast, Jonathan presented a slideshow, a curated display of memories that began innocently enough. Laughter filled the room as images of their travels and milestones flashed on the screen. Then, the tone shifted. Photographs of Elise and Daniel in compromising positions appeared, each one more damning than the last. Gasps echoed, the room descending into a stunned silence. Elise's face turned ashen, and Daniel's bravado crumbled. Jonathan, ever composed, raised his glass. "To truth," he said, his voice steady. "It has a way of surfacing no matter how deeply it's buried." The fallout was swift and irreversible. Elise fled the room, her world shattered, while Jonathan calmly filed for divorce the next morning, armed with incontrovertible evidence that ensured he'd emerge unscathed, both emotionally and financially. The aftermath. In the months that followed, Jonathan rebuilt his life, not as a man consumed by vengeance, but as one reborn through adversity. He found solace in new ventures, new connections, and the realization that betrayal, while devastating, could be a catalyst for transformation. As for Elise and Daniel, their lives unraveled. Stripped of their illusions, they were left to grapple with the consequences of their actions, an eternal reminder of the web they'd spun and the retribution that followed. And so, Jonathan moved forward, his head high and his heart lighter, knowing he'd orchestrated a revenge that was as poetic as it was just. The shadows of consequences. In the quiet months after the dramatic unraveling of his marriage, Jonathan found himself alone, not lonely, but contemplative. The revenge he had so meticulously orchestrated was a success, but it left a lingering emptiness, like a fire burned down to cold ashes. By day, he immersed himself in his work, transforming his business into a thriving empire. By night, he revisited the pieces of his life he had neglected during his marriage, reading novels that had long collected dust, reconnecting with old friends, and even trying his hand at painting. Yet revenge has a way of leaving scars, even on the one who wields it. One evening, as he sat in his studio, a knock came at the door. Opening it, he was startled to find Elise standing there, her once pristine appearance now disheveled, her eyes hollow. The broken reflection. "Jonathan, I need to talk," she began, her voice trembling. He hesitated but stepped aside, allowing her in. She looked around the apartment as though seeing it for the first time, her gaze lingering on the paintings adorning the walls, expressions of turmoil and catharsis that Jonathan hadn't realized were so revealing. "I owe you an apology," Elise said, breaking the silence. "Not for what I did. There's no excuse for that, but for the person I became. I lost myself, Jonathan, and I dragged you down with me." Her words were sincere, yet they stirred a conflict within him. He had wanted her to feel the weight of her betrayal, but seeing her like this, a shadow of the woman he once loved, was unsettling. "Why now?" he asked, his tone measured. "Because revenge doesn't heal," she replied, meeting his eyes. "I see that now. I'm trying to pick up the pieces of my life, and I thought you deserved to know. I'm not proud of who I was." Jonathan nodded, unsure of what to say. He didn't forgive her, not yet, but her vulnerability left him with an unexpected sense of pity rather than triumph. The return of shadows. Elise's visit stirred something Jonathan had buried, a sense of his own flaws in their marriage. While her betrayal was undeniable, he began to reflect on the ways he had perhaps contributed to their distance. His long hours, his relentless drive for success, and the unspoken resentments that had grown between them like weeds. Days turned into weeks, and life moved on. But just as he began to settle into his new normal, another ripple disrupted his world. A letter arrived, handwritten and unsigned, its contents cryptic yet unmistakable. "You thought you buried the truth, but it's still breathing. Be careful what you dig up." Jonathan's chest tightened as he reread the words. At first, he dismissed it as a prank, but as similar notes began appearing, on his car windshield, slipped under his office door, he realized someone was watching. Someone who knew more than they should. The hunter becomes the hunted. Driven by unease, Jonathan enlisted the help of the same private investigator who had exposed Elise's affair. Together, they retraced the steps of the past year, looking for any loose ends. What they uncovered was startling. Daniel, the man whose career Jonathan had obliterated, had resurfaced. He wasn't working alone. He had partnered with an old adversary of Jonathan's, a business rival named Victor Lang, whose ambitions Jonathan had crushed years ago. The two men had been watching, waiting, and plotting. Their plan was as insidious as it was personal. to dismantle Jonathan's life, not through scandal or betrayal, but by turning his own tactics against him. The chessboard revisited, Jonathan found himself thrust into a new kind of game, one where every move could be his last. Victor and Daniel weren't just seeking revenge. They were orchestrating a takeover of Jonathan's company, exploiting his vulnerabilities and using his own allies to undermine him. But Jonathan wasn't the same man he had been before. The trials of the past year had sharpened him, and he had learned to see through the masks people wore. He began countering their moves with precision, exposing Victor's financial misdeeds and outmaneuvering Daniel by leveraging his connections within the law firm. Yet the fight wasn't without cost. The constant vigilance, the unraveling of alliances he thought unbreakable, it all took its toll. The last gambit. As the battle reached its climax, Jonathan realized something profound. Revenge had consumed not just Elise and Daniel, but himself as well. The cycle of retribution had no end. It would only leave him hollow, endlessly chasing satisfaction that would never come. So he made a bold decision. Instead of continuing the fight, he confronted Victor and Daniel directly, not with threats, but with an offer. "Take what you want," he said. "If my success depends on destroying others, then I don't want it anymore. But know this, what you gain through deceit will never last." His words disarmed them, leaving them scrambling to understand the Phoenix's descent. Despite his attempts to move forward, Jonathan couldn't shake the sense that the game wasn't over. The lingering threats from Victor and Daniel weighed heavily on him, their vendetta evolving into something more insidious. They had begun targeting not just his business, but his reputation, whispering lies to the media, planting false stories that painted him as corrupt and ruthless. At first, Jonathan ignored it, believing the truth would outlast the lies. But as the attacks intensified, he realized he had underestimated their determination. His name, once synonymous with integrity, was now being dragged through the mud. Invitations to exclusive events dwindled, investors grew wary, and friends began to distance themselves. It wasn't just his professional life they sought to destroy. They wanted to break him completely. The trap. Within the trap. Determined not to let them win, Jonathan decided to take the fight to them, but this time with a different approach. He understood that Victor and Daniel thrived on chaos, so he resolved to use their own tactics against them. Jonathan reconnected with the private investigator, hiring him for one final job: to infiltrate Victor's inner circle and gather evidence of their schemes. For months, they worked in the shadows, piecing together a dossier of illegal dealings, fraudulent contracts, and backdoor alliances that Victor and Daniel had formed. But as Jonathan dug deeper, he uncovered something that shook him to his core. Among the files was a connection to someone he hadn't expected: Elise. The unexpected alliance. Elise, it seemed, had been coerced into working with Victor and Daniel after their fallout. They had threatened to expose sensitive information from her past, details that could ruin her career and reputation. She had reluctantly agreed, feeding them information about Jonathan's moves in exchange for their silence. When Jonathan confronted Elise, her reaction was a mix of guilt and desperation. "They cornered me, Jonathan," she admitted, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't know what else to do, but I swear I tried to protect you where I could." For a moment, Jonathan felt the familiar surge of anger, but it was tempered by something else: empathy. Elise was a pawn in a larger game, just as he had once been. Against all odds, he decided to trust her. Together, they devised a plan to turn the tables on Victor and Daniel, using Elise's position as a double agent to feed them misinformation while secretly recording their conversations. The Fall of Titans. The trap was set. Jonathan and Elise, lured Victor and Daniel into a high-stakes business meeting, presenting them with a fabricated opportunity too tempting to resist. Unbeknownst to them, the room was wired with hidden cameras and microphones, capturing every detail of their illegal dealings. When the meeting ended, Jonathan didn't confront them directly. Instead, he quietly handed over the evidence to the authorities and the press. Within days, Victor and Daniel's empire crumbled. Investigations uncovered years of fraud and corruption, leading to arrests and public disgrace. Their names became synonymous with scandal, their ambitions reduced to rubble. The road to redemption. With his enemies vanquished, Jonathan could have celebrated his victory, but instead he felt an overwhelming sense of exhaustion. Revenge had been a long and grueling road, and though justice was served, it came at a cost. Jonathan decided to step away from the cutthroat world of business entirely. He sold his remaining shares and donated a significant portion of the proceeds to charity, using the rest to start a foundation dedicated to mentoring young entrepreneurs. As for Elise, she began rebuilding her life with newfound purpose. She worked alongside Jonathan in his foundation, their shared experiences forging an unlikely bond. Though their romantic relationship had ended, they found a way to support each other as allies, bound by the lessons they had learned. The final chapter. Years later, Jonathan stood on the balcony of his seaside home, watching the sun dip below the horizon. Life had taken him through twists and turns he could never have anticipated, but in the end, he found peace, not in revenge, but in letting go. The scars of betrayal remained, but they no longer defined him. Instead, they became a testament to his resilience, a reminder that even in the face of darkness, he had chosen to rise above. And as the waves crashed against the shore, Jonathan smiled, knowing that his greatest revenge was not in defeating his enemies, but in reclaiming his life. The deeper game. Jonathan and Elise realized they had been pawns in Victor's scheme for years, their lives manipulated in ways they hadn't even noticed. Victor's actions weren't merely about revenge, they were about control, about orchestrating, a life where Jonathan and Elise were forever indebted to his presence. But Victor had underestimated them. Jonathan reached out to allies he hadn't called upon in years, powerful figures who owed him favors, investigators with access to international databases, and even journalists who thrived on uncovering hidden truths. Together, they began unearthing Victor's darkest secrets. What they found was explosive. Victor had a network of shell companies used for laundering money, ties to criminal organizations, and a trail of blackmail stretching across decades. But the most shocking revelation came when they discovered that Victor had manipulated Daniel, too. The affair between Daniel and Elise hadn't been an accident. It had been orchestrated. Victor had planted doubts in Daniel's mind, nudged him toward Elise, and then sat back to watch the chaos unfold. The final confrontation. Armed with irrefutable evidence, Jonathan and Elise lured Victor into a meeting under the guise of negotiating a truce. The setting was intentionally symbolic. A grand hall atop one of the city's tallest skyscrapers, overlooking the empire Victor had tried to claim. As Victor entered, his usual smirk faltered. The room was lined with monitors displaying the evidence against him: bank transactions, emails, recorded conversations. "You've spent years trying to destroy us," Jonathan said, his voice steady. "But you forgot one thing. No matter how deeply you bury the truth, it always finds its way to the surface." Victor's smirk returned, though weaker this time. "You think this changes anything? People like me don't fall. We adapt." "Not this time," Elise interjected, stepping forward. "This isn't just about you and Jonathan. It's about everyone. You've hurt everyone you've used to feed your ambitions. This ends now." Jonathan handed Victor a folder, documents tying him to every illegal activity they had uncovered. Victor's face darkened as he realized the magnitude of what they held. "You have two choices," Jonathan said calmly. "Walk out of here and face the consequences, or try to fight us and watch everything you've built burn to the ground." The collapse. Victor's downfall was swift and public. The evidence was handed over to authorities, and the media feasted on the story of his web of deceit. His business empire crumbled under the weight of investigations. His allies abandoned him, and his name became a cautionary tale of greed and obsession. Daniel, too, faced his reckoning. While his role was less sinister than Victor's, he couldn't escape the consequences of his actions. Stripped of his reputation and influence, he disappeared from public life, leaving behind a legacy of betrayal and regret. The aftermath. With Victor and Daniel out of the picture, Jonathan and Elise found themselves at a crossroads. Their journey through betrayal, revenge, and redemption had reshaped them in ways they hadn't expected. Elise decided to leave the city, moving to a quiet coastal town where she could rebuild her life away from the shadows of her past. She and Jonathan parted on amicable terms, grateful for the partnership that had brought them closure. Jonathan, meanwhile, chose to stay. But rather than return to the cutthroat world of business, he dedicated himself to helping others navigate the challenges he had faced. Through his foundation, he mentored young entrepreneurs, teaching them not just the strategies for success, but the importance of integrity and resilience. The peace within. Years later, Jonathan stood on the balcony of his new home overlooking the city that had once been both his battlefield and his sanctuary. The scars of betrayal remained, but they no longer defined him. In the end, Jonathan learned that true revenge wasn't about destroying others. It was about reclaiming his own life, his own peace. The path had been long and painful, but it had led him to a place of clarity and strength. As the sun set, casting a golden glow over the skyline, Jonathan smiled. The past would always be a part of him, but it no longer held him captive. He was free, and that was the greatest victory of all. The echoes of vengeance. Though Jonathan had found peace, the ghosts of the past had a way of lingering. Victor's empire may have crumbled, and Daniel's betrayal was now a distant memory, but the wounds left behind still itched at the edges of his consciousness. Just as he began to rebuild, another shadow emerged, a reminder that the game of revenge rarely ends cleanly. One evening, as Jonathan walked through the bustling streets of the city he once ruled, a familiar figure approached. Him. It was a woman dressed in a sleek black coat, her face partially obscured by the brim of a wide hat. "You don't know me, but you should," she said, handing him a small envelope before disappearing into the crowd. Jonathan opened the envelope and found a single photograph inside. It showed Victor, not in prison as he had believed, but seated at a table with several men, his expression smug. Beneath the image was a handwritten note. "He's still playing. Are you?" The second act. Shaken, Jonathan reached out to his contacts in law enforcement. They confirmed his worst fears. Victor had struck a deal to reduce his sentence, providing information about his criminal associates in exchange for his freedom. The man who had caused so much destruction was free and rebuilding his influence under a new alias. It wasn't just Victor's resurgence that troubled Jonathan. It was the realization that his revenge hadn't been the end. It had only been a chapter in a larger story. Driven by the need to protect the new life he had built, Jonathan began investigating Victor's movements. This time, he wouldn't act impulsively. He had learned from his previous battles that revenge, to be effective, required patience and precision. The unlikely alliance. As Jonathan delved deeper, he found himself crossing paths with someone unexpected, Maya, the woman who had slipped him the photograph. She introduced herself as a former ally of Victor, now seeking to expose him for reasons of her own. "I worked for him once," Maya admitted. "I believed in his promises, his vision. But he's a snake, and I won't let him destroy more lives." Jonathan was wary but recognized the value of her insider knowledge. Together, they pieced together Victor's new network, a web of shady business deals, illicit partnerships, and covert operations designed to restore his power. But Maya's involvement wasn't without risk. Victor had eyes everywhere, and their alliance soon caught his attention. The hunter becomes the hunted. One night, as Jonathan returned home, he noticed the door slightly ajar. Stepping inside cautiously, he found a single message scrawled across his living room wall in red ink. "You should have stayed out." Victor wasn't just rebuilding, he was retaliating. Jonathan's contacts began to vanish one by one, as Victor's reach extended into areas Jonathan hadn't anticipated. It became clear that this battle wouldn't end with legal documents or public scandals. It would end with confrontation. The final gambit, Jonathan and Maya devised a bold plan. They orchestrated a meeting with Victor, presenting it as a negotiation for peace. But beneath the surface, it was a carefully constructed trap. The meeting took place in an abandoned warehouse, its dim lighting casting long shadows across the walls. Victor arrived, his trademark smirk intact, flanked by 2 bodyguards. "So, Jonathan," Victor said, his voice dripping with mockery, "here we are again. You never learn, do you?" Jonathan didn't flinch. "This isn't about learning, Victor. It's about ending." At that moment, law enforcement officers swarmed the warehouse, their arrival triggered by a silent signal from Maya. Victor's smirk faltered as he realized the extent of Jonathan's planning. But Victor wasn't one to go down quietly. He reached for a concealed weapon, forcing Jonathan to act. In the chaos that followed, Jonathan and Maya narrowly avoided harm, but Victor managed to escape, vanishing into the night. The cost of revenge. Though Victor's network was dismantled once again, his escape left a bitter taste. For Jonathan, the pursuit of justice had become a cycle, each victory tinged with the knowledge that the battle might never truly end. Maya, too, carried scars from their ordeal. Yet their shared experience forged a bond, a partnership built not on trust but on mutual understanding. Jonathan knew one thing for certain. He couldn't let revenge consume him any longer. If Victor returned, he would be ready, but he wouldn't let the pursuit of vengeance define his life. The unfinished chapter. Years later, as Jonathan sat in his study, he received a package. Inside was a single chess piece, a black king, along with a note that read, "Checkmate is coming." Jonathan smiled, his resolve unshaken. He had learned that revenge wasn't just a game. It was a test of endurance, a measure of one's ability to rise above the darkness. The shadow war begins. Jonathan sat staring at the black king chess piece, its glossy surface reflecting the dim light of his study. The message, "Checkmate is coming," was as much a promise as it was a challenge. Victor's escape had left Jonathan with a haunting reminder that some battles don't end cleanly. For the next few weeks, Jonathan prepared in silence. He doubled his security, put his assets into blind trusts, and reached out to allies who owed him favors. Victor might have escaped the law, but Jonathan knew he wouldn't stay in the shadows for long. As he reviewed his contingency plans, Maya returned with troubling news. "Victor's not just regrouping," she said. "He's building something bigger. New players, new strategies, and this time he's targeting more than just you. He wants to destroy everything you've ever built." Jonathan clenched his fists. "Then we'll make sure he doesn't succeed." The gathering storm. Victor's resurgence wasn't just a rumor. Over the following months, Jonathan began to notice subtle shifts in the business landscape. Anonymous shell companies started buying up properties near his foundation's headquarters. Investors he trusted suddenly pulled out of joint ventures. Media outlets published stories questioning his past successes, clearly seeded by someone with a vendetta. Maya and Jonathan worked tirelessly to trace the threads. They uncovered a network of individuals loyal to Victor, many of whom had motives to see Jonathan fail. Each discovery felt like uncovering a hidden piece of a chessboard, with Victor's Black King moving ever closer. But Jonathan wasn't idle. He reached out to Elise, now living quietly on the coast, and asked for her help. "Victor won't stop," Jonathan said, "and I can't do this alone." Elise hesitated but eventually agreed. "If we're going to stop him, we need to be smarter than we were last time." A dangerous alliance. To take the fight to Victor, Jonathan needed someone who understood the criminal underworld better than he ever could. Maya introduced him to a man named Anton, a former enforcer who had once worked for Victor, but had turned on him after a bitter fallout. "You're playing with fire, Graves," Anton warned. "Victor doesn't just want revenge, he wants to bury you so deep no one will remember your name." "Let him try," Jonathan replied. With Anton's help, Jonathan began striking at Victor's new operations. They sabotaged supply lines, exposed financial fraud, and sowed mistrust among Victor's allies. Each move was calculated to dismantle Victor's power base piece by piece. The Queen's Gambit. As Victor's empire began to falter again, he grew more desperate. He sent cryptic threats to Jonathan, promises of retribution that escalated with each passing day. But Jonathan knew Victor well enough to anticipate his next move. Maya and Elise worked together to craft a counterstrike. They leaked false information suggesting Jonathan would be attending an exclusive event, baiting Victor into making a public appearance. The plan was to corner him with undeniable evidence of his continued crimes. The event, held at a luxurious downtown hotel, was a glittering affair. As guests mingled and champagne flowed, Victor arrived, disguised but unmistakable to Jonathan's trained eye. Elise, posing as an attendee, sidled up to Victor and whispered, "Checkmate, Victor." Before he could react, authorities moved in, tipped off by a carefully timed call from Maya. The final face-off. But Victor wasn't alone. His men were strategically placed throughout the venue, and chaos erupted as they attempted to extract him. Jonathan, watching from a hidden vantage point, realized the fight was far from over. "Get him out of here alive," Jonathan said to Maya, who nodded and joined the fray. As the authorities clashed with Victor's men, Jonathan followed Victor through the chaos. They ended up in a deserted corridor, face to face for the first time in months. "You should have stayed down, Victor," Jonathan said. "And you should have learned when to quit," Victor sneered, pulling a weapon. Before Victor could act, Maya appeared, disarming him with a swift move. "It's over," she said, her voice cold. "The true victory." Victor was arrested, this time, with airtight evidence of his crimes. His network crumbled under the weight of investigations, and his name became synonymous with infamy. Jonathan stood outside the courthouse after Victor's sentencing, feeling a strange sense of relief. The battle had cost him time, resources, and trust, but he had emerged stronger. For the first time in years, Jonathan allowed himself to breathe deeply. The war was over, not because he had destroyed his enemy, but because he had reclaimed control over his life. A new beginning. Jonathan returned to his foundation with a renewed sense of purpose. He worked alongside Maya and Elise to expand their reach, turning the lessons of his trials into wisdom for others. The deeper betrayal. Months had passed since Jonathan's confrontation with Victor, and his life had finally settled into a semblance of normalcy. He had rebuilt his foundation, surrounded himself with trusted allies, and begun to focus on creating something meaningful. But just as he started to believe he could leave the past behind, life dealt him another cruel blow. One evening, Jonathan returned home to find Elise waiting for him in his study. Her demeanor was tense, her expression unreadable. "We need to talk," she said, her voice tight. Jonathan sat down, his mind racing. The last time they'd had such a conversation, it had shattered his world. "I've made mistakes," Elise began, her gaze fixed on the floor. "I thought we were moving forward, but I've been seeing someone." Jonathan froze. The words hit him like a physical blow. "What are you saying, Elise?" She looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't want it to happen, but it did. I'm sorry." The spiral. The revelation reopened old wounds Jonathan thought had healed. Betrayal was a familiar sting, but coming from Elise again, it was unbearable. "Who is it this time?" he asked, his voice cold. "A colleague," Elise admitted. "Someone I met through the foundation." Jonathan's mind raced. Not only had she betrayed him again, but she had done so within the walls of the organization they had worked so hard to build together. "Get out," he said finally, his tone devoid of emotion. Elise hesitated but complied, leaving Jonathan alone with his thoughts. The plan takes shape. Unlike before, Jonathan didn't fall into despair. He channeled his pain into action, determined to protect himself and his legacy. This time he wouldn't simply let the betrayal pass. He would ensure that Elise and her accomplice understood the gravity of their actions. Through his connections, Jonathan uncovered the identity of the man Elise had been seeing. Aaron, a mid-level manager at the foundation. He was married, with a reputation for ambition and secrecy. Jonathan didn't confront Aaron immediately. Instead, he began to gather evidence, documenting every detail of the affair. He hired a private investigator, planted discreet surveillance, devices, and even used his legal team to scrutinize Aaron's activities at the foundation. What he discovered was more than just a personal betrayal. Aaron had been embezzling funds, using his position to siphon money into shell accounts. Elise's involvement was minimal, but her association with him placed her in a precarious position. The revelation. At a board meeting a few weeks later, Jonathan presented his findings. The room fell silent as he laid out the evidence, his voice calm and authoritative. Aaron was present, his face pale as Jonathan detailed the financial discrepancies. Elise, seated at the far end of the table, looked as though she might faint. "This foundation stands for integrity," Jonathan said, addressing the room. "Anyone who compromises that has no place here." Aaron was escorted out by security, his protests falling on deaf ears. Elise sat frozen, unable to meet Jonathan's gaze. The final goodbye. That evening, Elise came to Jonathan's office, tears in her eyes. "You've made your point," she said softly. "I know I've hurt you, and I know I can't fix this." Jonathan looked at her, his expression unreadable. "You're right. You can't." He handed her a folder containing divorce papers. "It's time we stop pretending this can work. We've both done enough damage." Elise nodded, accepting the papers without protest. "I'm sorry, Jonathan, for everything." He didn't respond, watching silently as she walked away for the last time. The future unwritten. With Elise and Aaron out of his life, Jonathan turned, his attention fully to his work. He had lost much, but he refused to let betrayal define him. Instead, he used the experience to strengthen his resolve, ensuring that his foundation and his legacy would remain untouchable. Though the scars of betrayal remained, Jonathan found solace in the knowledge that he had faced his trials with strength and dignity. And as he looked toward the future, he knew that he had the power to shape it on his own terms. The betrayal rekindled. Jonathan's life had been reshaped by betrayal and redemption, but his world was once again teetering on the edge of chaos. After Elise's departure, he had found a semblance of peace, but her actions had planted seeds of mistrust that lingered in his mind. He had learned to look deeper, to question the motives of those around him, and that vigilance revealed a hidden truth he hadn't anticipated. Elise's betrayal was far more calculated than he first believed. The hidden agenda. Months after, Elise signed the divorce papers. Jonathan received an anonymous tip, a file detailing a string of transactions linking Elise to Victor's resurgence. At first, he dismissed it as impossible. Elise had been manipulative, yes, but she wouldn't have allied with Victor, not after everything he had done. But as Jonathan dug deeper, he uncovered a chilling pattern. Elise hadn't just been complicit. In Victor's schemes, she had been actively working with him. Her affair with Aaron was a smokescreen, a diversion from her true intentions, to dismantle Jonathan's empire from within and funnel resources back to Victor. Fury burned through Jonathan as he pieced it all together. Elise's betrayal wasn't personal. It was strategic, and that made it all the more unforgivable. Setting the trap. Jonathan knew he couldn't confront Elise or Victor directly, not yet. They were cunning, and any misstep could drive them further underground. Instead, he began laying a trap, enlisting the help of Maya and Anton to orchestrate a carefully planned sting operation. Using the evidence he had gathered, Jonathan created a false trail of lucrative opportunities that he knew would lure Victor and Elise into the open. They couldn't resist the promise of a windfall, especially one that appeared vulnerable to manipulation. As expected, the bait worked. Elise, under Victor's orders, initiated contact with the supposed investors, unaware that every move was being monitored. The reckoning. The climax of Jonathan's plan unfolded in a private suite at an exclusive hotel. Elise and Victor arrived expecting to finalize their deal with the investors. Instead, they found Jonathan waiting for them, flanked by law enforcement, officers, and several of the Foundation's board members. Victor's smug expression faltered as Jonathan stepped forward. "You underestimated me, Victor," Jonathan said, his voice steady. "And you, Elise, I thought I knew you, but you were just another pawn in his game." Elise's face twisted in anger. "You think you're better than us, Jonathan? You're just as ruthless. You just hide it behind your foundation and your sanctimonious speeches." "Maybe," Jonathan replied. "But at least I stand for something." As the authorities moved in to arrest Victor and Elise, Jonathan felt a surge of satisfaction. This time there would be no escape, no deals to bargain for freedom. The fallout. With Victor and Elise behind bars, Jonathan turned his focus back to the Foundation. The betrayal had left scars, but it had also revealed the strength of his resolve. Maya, ever the pragmatist, offered him a piece of advice. "Don't let them take any more from you. Move on, rebuild, and remember, you won." Jonathan nodded, but he couldn't shake the lingering question of whether victory was ever truly possible in a game built on betrayal. A new beginning. As the city moved on from the scandal, Jonathan found solace in his work. He had been tested in ways he never thought possible, but he had emerged stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever to build a legacy that couldn't be destroyed. Sitting in his office one evening, he looked at a blank page in his journal. After a moment, he wrote a single line: "Trust is fragile, but resilience is unbreakable." And with that, he closed the chapter on betrayal, ready to write the story of his future. The ghosts of betrayal. Though Victor and Elise were behind bars, the weight of their betrayal lingered like a shadow over Jonathan's life. He had won, but victory had come at a cost: his faith in others, his ability to trust, and a part of himself that once believed in redemption. Months passed, And while the foundation flourished under his leadership, Jonathan found it increasingly difficult to connect with those around him. Maya had stayed by his side, offering a steady presence, but even she noticed his growing isolation. "You've got to let this go," she said one evening as they shared a quiet drink at a rooftop bar. "You've beaten Victor. Elise is out of your life." "What more do you need?" Jonathan stared at the city lights below. "It's not about needing more. It's about making sure no one ever tries to take what I've built again." The unexpected letter. One day, Jonathan received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a handwritten note that sent a chill down his spine. "The game isn't over." Alongside the note was a photograph of Victor, standing in what appeared to be a prison yard, smirking at the camera. On the back of the photo was a date, 2 weeks away. Jonathan's instincts told him it wasn't a bluff. Despite being incarcerated, Victor had always been resourceful. This was a warning, a declaration that he still had power and reach. Unraveling the plan. Determined not to be blindsided, Jonathan called in every favor he was owed. He reached out to Anton, who had connections in places most people couldn't imagine, and to Maya, who had become his most trusted ally. "If Victor's planning something, we need to know what it is and stop it before it starts," Jonathan said. Through painstaking investigation, they uncovered fragments of Victor's plan. It involved a series of coordinated actions designed to discredit Jonathan and destabilize his foundation. From within the prison, Victor had been orchestrating his moves, using loyal operatives on the outside. The decoy. To counter Victor, Jonathan devised a bold strategy. He fed false information into Victor's network, creating the illusion of vulnerability. The goal was to lure Victor's operatives into the open, exposing their identities and dismantling their plans. It was a dangerous game, one that required precision and patience. Maya took the lead in coordinating the counterstrike, while Anton provided critical intelligence. As the date on the photograph approached, tensions rose. Every step forward seemed to reveal another layer of Victor's web, a reminder of how deeply he had embedded himself in Jonathan's life. The day of reckoning on. The day marked in the photograph, Jonathan and his team were ready. They had identified key operatives in Victor's network and coordinated with law enforcement to stage simultaneous raids. The operation was a success. Several of Victor's allies were apprehended, and their communications revealed the full extent of his plans. But one piece of the puzzle remained missing: Victor himself. That evening, Jonathan received a call. The voice on the other end was unmistakable. "You think you've won again," Victor said, his tone mocking. "But this isn't over. You'll never truly be free of me." Jonathan clenched his jaw. "Keep playing your games, Victor. I'll always be one step ahead." The final confrontation. The call wasn't just a taunt, it was a clue. Using the information gathered during the raids, Jonathan traced Victor's secret communications to a corrupt guard inside the prison. The guard had been facilitating Victor's activities, allowing him to operate with impunity. With this new evidence, Jonathan worked with authorities to remove Victor's influence once and for all. The corrupt guard was arrested, and Victor was transferred to a maximum security facility, stripped of his remaining connections. As the transport van carrying Victor disappeared into the night, Jonathan felt a weight lift from his shoulders. For the first time, he truly believed that the chapter was closed, a life reclaimed. In the aftermath, Jonathan began to rebuild not just his foundation, but himself. He focused on fostering genuine connections, letting go of the paranoia that had consumed him. Maya remained a steadfast presence, and over time their partnership evolved into something deeper. Together, they worked to ensure that the lessons of Jonathan's trials would benefit others, turning his pain into purpose. Sitting in his office one evening, Jonathan reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. He picked up the Black King chess piece that had become a symbol of his battles and placed it back on the board. The game is over, he thought, and this time I've won. A new betrayal unfolds. Jonathan had just begun to feel the stirrings of peace when the whispers of another betrayal emerged. This time it was closer to home, far closer than he ever imagined. Life had seemingly returned to normal, with the foundation flourishing and new initiatives underway. Maya, his loyal ally, was now his closest confidant, and they had grown into a team that could face any storm. Yet, Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling that someone was working against him from within. The seeds of doubt. It started with small things, misplaced documents, subtle changes to schedules, and odd decisions made in Jonathan's name. At first, he dismissed these as clerical errors or misunderstandings, but the incidents grew more frequent and pointed. Maya noticed his unease. "Something's wrong, isn't it?" she asked during one of their late-night strategy meetings. Jonathan nodded, his jaw tight. "Someone's trying to sabotage us again, Maya, and I think they're closer than we think, the hidden enemy." Determined not to repeat the mistakes of the past, Jonathan launched a discreet investigation. He tapped into every resource, monitoring his team with the same precision that had helped him dismantle Victor's network. The trail eventually led him to someone he never expected. Rachel, his newly appointed chief operations officer, a rising star in the Foundation, who had earned his trust with her innovative ideas and unwavering dedication. Rachel had been quietly siphoning resources, rerouting funds to untraceable accounts. But the true shock came when Jonathan discovered who she was working with: Elise. The return of the Queen. Elise had been released from prison months earlier, her sentence reduced for good behavior. She had disappeared after her release, but clearly she hadn't moved on. Instead, she had returned to orchestrate a new betrayal, using Rachel as her inside agent. Jonathan felt the familiar sting of betrayal, sharper this time for having trusted again. "She's not even subtle about it," Maya said, reviewing the evidence. "She wants you to know it's her." Jonathan clenched his fists. "She won't get away with it this time." The counter-strike. Rather than confront Rachel immediately, Jonathan decided to turn the tables. He fed her false information, creating the illusion of a major project that would funnel millions into a vulnerable account. It was bait Elise wouldn't be able to resist. Rachel took the information straight to Elise. Unaware that every move was being monitored, Jonathan and Maya tracked their communications, gathering irrefutable evidence of their collusion. The final betrayal. The showdown came during a high-profile gala hosted by the Foundation. Rachel, oblivious to the trap, attended alongside Jonathan and the board. Elise, confident in her untouchability, watched from the shadows. As the event reached its peak, Jonathan took the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady, "tonight is about celebrating the integrity and resilience of this organization, but it's also about accountability." He gestured toward the large screens around the room, where damning evidence of Rachel and Elise's schemes began to play. Gasps echoed through the crowd as the truth unfolded. Rachel tried to slip away, but security intercepted her. Elise, realizing she had been outmaneuvered, stepped forward, her face a mask of defiance. "You think this changes anything?" Elise sneered. "You'll never truly be free of me." Jonathan met her gaze, his voice calm but firm. "You've already lost, Elise. This time, there's no coming back." The aftermath: Elise and Rachel were arrested, their conspiracy laid bare for all to see. The Foundation emerged stronger, its reputation bolstered by Jonathan's decisive action. But the cost of the betrayal lingered. Jonathan stood in his office that night, staring at the Black King chess piece on his desk. It had become a symbol of his battles, but he wondered if the game would ever truly end. Maya entered, her presence grounding him. "You did the right thing," she said. "I'm tired of being right," Jonathan replied, his voice weary. "I just want to build something that lasts." "You will," Maya said, "because you don't give up." The legacy. In the months that followed, Jonathan took steps to ensure the Foundation's future couldn't be undermined again. He created safeguards, nurtured a culture of transparency, and surrounded himself with people who shared his vision. Though the scars of betrayal remained, they became part of his story, a testament to his resilience and determination. As he stood on the balcony of his office one evening, watching the city lights flicker below, Jonathan allowed himself a moment of reflection. The game may never truly end, he thought, but I'll always be ready to play. The final chapter. With the arrests of Elise and Rachel, Jonathan thought the storm had finally passed. But there was one truth he had to accept. Betrayal, once it has marked a person's life, never truly fades. It becomes part of them, woven into the fabric of their story. And while the battles were won, the scars would remain, not as reminders of pain, but as symbols of strength. Jonathan's reputation grew, not just as a leader, but as a man who had weathered unimaginable storms. His foundation flourished, its programs reaching more people than ever. He had learned the hard way that trust was a precious thing, easily broken, but just as easily rebuilt if the right people were found. Maya had stayed by his side, a constant in a world that had never stopped shifting. They had become more than allies. They were family. But Jonathan had a new mission now, not to avenge betrayal, but to ensure no one ever suffered as he had. A legacy of trust. Years passed, and Jonathan's efforts bore fruit. The Foundation became a symbol of hope for many, a testament to the idea that from the deepest betrayals could come the greatest triumphs. His story, one of pain and perseverance, inspired others to take control of their destinies, no matter how dark the past. One day, Jonathan received a letter from an old acquaintance, a man who had watched from the sidelines as Jonathan's world had unraveled. The letter read, "The world is waiting for the next chapter. What will you build next?" It was signed simply, Victor. Jonathan smiled as he read the words. He had no intention of letting Victor's shadow ever fall on his work again. But he understood now. The past wasn't something to avenge, it was something to learn from. He was ready for whatever the future held. The legacy lives on. Jonathan stood before a new crowd, a fresh generation eager to hear the story of resilience, of turning betrayal into something greater. This time, he didn't talk about revenge or pain. Instead, he spoke of rebuilding, of creating something that could withstand the harshest storms. Betrayal has a way of showing you who you truly are, Jonathan said. But it's what you do with that knowledge that defines you. The crowd was silent, hanging on every word. For the first time in years, Jonathan felt at peace. He had fought the battles, weathered the storms, and emerged not unscathed, but unbroken. His legacy wasn't just about the foundation he had built. It was about the strength to rebuild after everything had been torn down. As he stepped off the stage, Maya caught his eye and smiled. In that moment, Jonathan knew that the final chapter of his story was not defined by the battles fought, but by the hope he had inspired in others. And for the first time in a long time, Jonathan felt free.